They thought he was just an old man with ruined vegetables and no one to fight for him. They didn't know his silver hair had once worn a helmet, and his son wore stars on his shoulders. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile, indifferent glow over the police station's waiting area. Elijah Brooks sat alone on the hard plastic bench, his posture erect but weary, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if holding on to some invisible anchor. What truly drew the attention of the occasional passerby, however, was not his dignified stillness, nor the slow, pained breaths that rose and fell from his chest. It was the garish smear of fluorescent orange paint streaked brutally across his silver hair, dripping down his temple like a grotesque wound. He sat beneath the assault of stares, some furtive, some pitying, most deliberately averted. The pungent chemical scent of the paint clung stubbornly to the air around him, setting him apart from the sterile environment like a scar across a blank page. Across the counter, Officer Travis Denton leaned lazily against his workstation, a sardonic smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His heavy boots tapped an irregular rhythm against the floor, a sound that grated against the heavy silence of the room. The can of industrial paint he had wielded so brazenly still sat within arm's reach, a gaudy, mocking testament to what had transpired. "You see, old man," Denton had sneered moments earlier, his voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear. "We're helping mark the areas under redevelopment. You're just ahead of schedule." No one in the room had dared respond. Some stole anxious glances at Elijah. Others buried their faces in paperwork or pretended an intense interest in the speckled linoleum floor. Fear was a heavy, smothering presence here. Fear of the badge, fear of reprisal, fear of entanglement. Elijah had not flinched. He had not spoken. He had simply endured, his shoulders squared against the invisible blows, the humiliation burning hotter than the stinging paint on his skin. Inside, though, a different storm raged. How had it come to this? He had merely sought help, a simple, bureaucratic step. He had dressed carefully that morning, smoothing out the old but clean shirt, adjusting his battered watch, pressing a crease into his slacks. Small rituals of dignity. He had walked the cracked sidewalks to this station, heart heavy but hopeful, armed with nothing but the belief that fairness could still be found, that somewhere within this city's concrete veins, justice still pulsed. Now, with each tick of the second hand on the grimy wall clock, that hope drained from him, replaced by a hollow ache that settled deep into his bones. Across the room, Travis Denton shifted, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, but mistaking it for submission rather than the slow forging of resolve. He tossed the empty spray can onto the desk with a clatter and turned away, humming a dissonant tune under his breath. Behind the counter, the receptionist continued to type, each keystroke a sharp, indifferent percussion against the injustice hanging in the air. Elijah closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. He would not cry. He would not give Denton, or anyone here, the satisfaction of witnessing his despair. But even as he willed the tears away, another thought crept in, unbidden. Marcus, his son, his pride, his stubborn, brilliant boy who had grown into a man of principle and steel. Marcus, who wore his uniform not as a symbol of power, but as a shield for those without it. Elijah's hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket for his phone. The device felt heavy, almost foreign in his hand. For a moment he hesitated, pride warring with desperation. He had called Marcus so rarely over the years, not wanting to burden him, not wanting to intrude on the life his son had built with such discipline and sacrifice. But today was different. Today the weight was too great to bear alone. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah pressed the speed dial. He held the phone to his ear, listening to the first ring, then the second, each one thudding against his ribs like a drum of judgment. Finally, a click. "Hey, Dad," Marcus's voice came, warm and strong through the static. "Everything okay?" Elijah's throat tightened. He glanced around the sterile waiting room, at the paint drying tackily on his skin, at the shame he could no longer scrub away. "I'm fine," he lied, voice cracking against the effort. I just wanted to hear your voice." And though the words trembled with the enormity of everything left unsaid, Marcus heard them. He heard them and understood. Miles away, Marcus Washington rose to his feet, already reaching for his uniform jacket, already moving toward the door without waiting for permission or apology. He didn't need details. He didn't need explanations. He only knew that his father needed him. Marcus's grip tightened around the phone, jaw clenched as images began to form in his mind. Vivid, uninvited, and suffocating. He pictured his father sitting alone, shoulders squared in defiance, yet heart fraying beneath the weight of decades-long restraint. He imagined the look in his father's eyes, not of fear, but of betrayal. Betrayal by the very system he had once served. That vision alone was enough to make Marcus's chest burn. With swift, practiced hands, he clipped the brass nameplate to his uniform, laced his boots, and secured the silver stars that marked his rank. This wasn't just a visit, it was a reckoning. Before the paint, before the sterile lights and the silent stares, Elijah Brooks had lived a life most would call unremarkable. He wasn't the type of man whose name adorned plaques or whose face appeared in newspapers. No, his victories were quieter, stitched into the everyday fabric of a modest life built from sacrifice and endurance. He lived alone in a weathered duplex at the edge of a neighborhood caught in the slow, merciless grip of redevelopment. New gleaming buildings crept closer by the month, swallowing familiar streets and replacing them with glass and steel. But Elijah stayed, stubborn, steadfast. His small backyard was his sanctuary, a patch of green resilience amid the dust and concrete. Every morning he tended to it like a sacred duty. Rows of collard greens, tomatoes, and squash, their leaves stretching hungrily toward the sun. The soil, cracked and stubborn, responded to his patience. It was a small thing perhaps, but in a world that so often seemed indifferent, it was something he could nurture, something he could control. He rarely spoke about his past. Neighbors who had lived long enough remembered snippets, whispers about Vietnam, about medals tucked away somewhere in a dusty box. Elijah never confirmed or denied. He didn't wear his history like armor. He carried it quietly, like a scar beneath a well-worn shirt. To the children who scampered down the sidewalks, he was simply Mr. Brooks, the old man who fixed broken bicycles and handed out cold lemonade in the summer. To the adults, he was a reassuring constant, a living testament to perseverance. But not everyone saw him that way. As the neighborhood changed, resentment festered. Outsiders moved in with plans and money and ambition. Longtime residents like Elijah became obstacles, holdouts, standing in the way of progress. There were rumors, of course. Vandalism, petty thefts, harassment designed to pressure the old-timers to leave. Elijah had heard them all but paid little mind. He believed if he kept his head down, if he minded his business, he'd be left alone. He was wrong. That morning, Elijah had stepped into his backyard as he did every day, humming softly to himself. But the sight that greeted him froze the song in his throat. The garden was destroyed. Wooden stakes ripped from the ground. Plants trampled into tangled heaps of broken stems and bruised leaves. His collards, his tomatoes, smashed or stolen, left to rot in the dirt. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a message. For a long moment he stood there, the cool morning air prickling his skin. Anger, sadness, and a sickening wave of helplessness crashed over him. The material loss was small. Seeds could be replanted, fences rebuilt. But the violation, the utter disregard, dug deeper than any physical damage. It made him feel unwelcome in the place he had spent a lifetime calling home. He thought briefly about letting it go, about patching the fence himself, clearing the wreckage, and pretending it hadn't happened. But something inside him, a stubborn ember of dignity, refused. No, they had crossed a line. He would file a report, not because he expected the police to find the culprits. He wasn't naive, but an official record could help him petition the housing authority for assistance with repairs. His pension barely covered basic expenses. Replacing a fence would stretch him thin. More than that, filing the report was a stand, a quiet assertion that he had the same rights as anyone else, that he would not simply disappear to make room for someone else's vision of progress. He had dressed carefully, smoothing out the cleanest shirt he owned, pressing the creases from his trousers with the back of a worn iron. He checked the clock, then the mirror, adjusting his battered watch and nodding slightly to his reflection. "You're still here," he murmured to himself, "and you still matter." The walk to the precinct was short but heavy with expectation. He had rehearsed what he would say. Clear, respectful, straightforward. He carried no illusions of special treatment, just a quiet hope for fairness. As he approached the squat, aging building, Elijah noticed the new construction cranes looming behind it, skeletal giants reshaping the skyline. He paused for a breath, then pushed open the door and stepped inside. The receptionist barely glanced up. Forms, signatures, waiting. Elijah took a seat, folding his hands over his knee, the quiet weight of his presence ignored by those around him. Time stretched out, measured only by the distant ringing of phones and the squeak of cheap soles against linoleum. Finally, his name was called. He rose slowly, feeling the familiar creak of old joints, and made his way to the counter where a man waited, not looking up from his computer screen. "Name?" the officer barked. "Elijah Brooks," he said, voice steady. "Nature of complaint?" "My garden, behind my house. It's been vandalized." The officer, Travis Denton, according to the faded nameplate pinned askew to his uniform, sighed audibly. He looked Elijah up and down, eyes sharp with disdain. "Some kids wrecked your tomatoes, and you think that's a police matter?" Elijah swallowed the sting, standing a little taller. "I just want it recorded, sir. That's all." Denton leaned back in his chair, a smirk curdling at the edge of his mouth. "We're a little busy handling real crimes, old man. Maybe next time, plant plastic vegetables." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than any shouted insult. And somewhere in the bowels of that gray, lifeless building, an even darker cruelty was beginning to stir. Elijah stood at the counter, the clipboard heavier than it should have been. The words he had planned, simple, measured, respectful, now felt unwelcome in his mouth. He had rehearsed them silently during his walk here, pacing them with the rhythm of his steps. But standing in front of Officer Travis Denton, those words withered. Denton didn't even glance at him properly. His eyes skimmed over Elijah the way one might glance at a stain on the floor. Brief, dismissive, faintly annoyed. His fingers tapped lazily at a keyboard, then stopped. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling with exaggerated boredom. "You're here about what? Some broken vegetables?" he asked. Elijah kept his voice steady. "Yes, sir. My garden was vandalized. Fence pushed down, plants trampled." Denton scoffed. "So what you want us to do? Dust cabbage leaves for prints?" A low chuckle came from somewhere behind the desk. Elijah didn't look to see who it was. He kept his eyes forward, locked onto Denton's indifferent gaze. "I only want to file a report," Elijah said. "So there's a record. It's happened more than once. I was hoping maybe increased patrols might help." Denton tilted his head, mock thoughtful. "Patrols? For a tomato patch?" Elijah felt heat rise in his face, and not from shame but from the slow building burn of being condescended to. "It's not just vegetables," he said. "It's about feeling safe in my home." The smirk returned, deeper now, almost satisfied. "You people," Denton muttered, shaking his head, "always so dramatic. Maybe next time, plant something useful." The words hung there. No one intervened. The receptionist pretended not to hear. Another officer nearby glanced up, then quickly turned away. The silence of the room was worse than noise. Louder, more damning. It wasn't just that no one stopped Denton. It was that no one was surprised. Elijah gripped the clipboard tighter. "I've lived in that home since '74, he said quietly. Denton leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Yeah? And the city's been trying to clean up that whole block since '80. Some folks just don't get the message." He reached under the desk and pulled out a can. Fluorescent orange spray paint, its nozzle already stained. Elijah didn't move, didn't blink. For a heartbeat, he thought, hoped, it was some kind of sick joke. But Denton stood up, raised the can, and with a sharp hiss, sprayed a long streak directly into Elijah's hair. The cold wetness shocked him first, then the smell, harsh, industrial, violating. Orange paint splattered his silver hair, ran down his temple, soaked into the collar of the shirt he had pressed just that morning. The chemical sting crept into his nostrils. The color was garish, angry, and bright enough to scream. No one stopped it. Not the clerk, not the other officers. not the few civilians who sat nearby, eyes wide, mouth shut. They all saw. None reacted. "There," Denton said, stepping back, admiring his work like a vandal signing a wall. "Now you're properly marked." Elijah didn't react, not outwardly. His muscles stiffened, his chest tightened, but he didn't cry out, didn't raise a hand. Instead, he reached into his pocket and retrieved a handkerchief, unfolded it with care, and began dabbing at the paint. It smeared more than it cleaned, leaving fiery orange streaks against his skin. He sat down slowly on the nearest bench. The cold plastic pressed against his spine, but he welcomed it. It grounded him, gave him something real to hold on to in a moment that felt entirely unreal. The receptionist returned to typing. Denton dropped the spray can onto the desk with a clatter, as if the show was over. But for Elijah, something inside had just cracked. He had faced combat, faced loss, faced being forgotten. But this was something colder. A cruelty served not in violence, but in humiliation, carved into the very place that claimed to serve and protect. His mind blurred for a moment, then cleared. He wouldn't break. Not in front of them. He took a slow breath and pulled out his phone. Not to call 911, not to file a complaint that would be swallowed in bureaucracy. He did what any father would do when he had no one else left to call. He texted his son. "Just wanted to say thanks for answering earlier. Don't worry, I'm fine." He added a period, then deleted it. Added a smiley face, then deleted that too. Eventually, he sent it plain, without emotion, the way a soldier might report his own injury. There was no reply. Not yet. So Elijah waited. The paint dried, tightening against his skin. Every breath reminded him of its stench. His neck itched where it had seeped beneath the collar. He folded his hands again, rested them in his lap, and waited as if waiting were the last act of dignity he could perform. An hour passed, then the door to the precinct opened with a sharp creak, and a different kind of silence fell across the room. Boots tapped smartly on linoleum. A uniform approached, green, crisp, and unmistakable. 2 silver stars shimmered on the shoulders. The man who wore them moved with precision and purpose. Marcus Brooks had arrived, and this time someone was going to listen. The sound of Marcus's boots on the tile was sharp, deliberate, each step a declaration. He moved like a man accustomed to being listened to walking into chaos and bringing it to heel. His posture was impossibly straight, his uniform pristine, and the 2 silver stars on his shoulders shimmered under the flickering fluorescent lights. Elijah didn't look up right away. He didn't need to. He recognized that cadence, the tempo of footsteps that once echoed in the hallways of their modest home, the unspoken rhythm of a boy raised to stand tall. Now, that boy was a man forged in discipline, tempered by duty and burning with purpose. The room, which had moments ago been indifferent to an elderly man's humiliation, fell into a tense, uncertain hush. Conversations halted. Chairs creaked as heads turned. The receptionist stopped typing. Officer Denton, lounging smugly at his desk, froze mid-sentence as his gaze locked on the approaching figure. His mouth, slightly open, tried to form words but failed. Marcus didn't even glance at him. He walked straight to Elijah, knelt beside the bench, and placed a firm, steady hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad," he said quietly. Only then did Elijah meet his eyes. And when he did, Marcus felt the fury rise again, hot, immediate, and nearly blinding. His father's hair was crusted with dried paint, his shirt collar stained a glaring orange, and his expression, calm but hollow, was more painful than any wound Marcus had ever seen on a battlefield. "What happened?" he asked, though his voice already trembled with the answer. Elijah's eyes didn't drop. "It was him," he said plainly, nodding toward the desk. Denton flinched as if struck. "Now hold on!" Marcus stood. The shift in the room was seismic. At full height, he towered over Denton, not just in stature, but in presence. There was nothing theatrical about his anger. It radiated from him quietly, the kind that made people listen. "My name is Colonel Marcus Brooks," he said, voice clear and resonant. "United States Army, currently stationed at the office of the Chief of Staff, Pentagon." He paused, letting the words settle like a judge's gavel. "The man you just assaulted, humiliated, is my father, Elijah Brooks. a Vietnam veteran, a Silver Star recipient, and a citizen of this country. Denton's face had gone pale. The room was so quiet the hum of the vending machine seemed thunderous. I didn't know who he was," Denton said, trying to laugh. "He came in ranting about vegetables." "He came in to file a police report," Marcus snapped. "And instead, you degraded him in front of a room full of witnesses." You were just abusing your power?" Marcus interrupted again, "because you thought no one would hold you accountable." The calm in his voice made it worse, more damning. The anger was there, but controlled, aimed like a rifle. Elijah remained seated, silent, watching his son not with pride, but something quieter. Relief. A door opened behind the desk, and another man stepped out. Older, with the tired but sharp eyes of someone used to cleaning up messes. Lieutenant Harold Quinn. The moment he took in the scene, the uniform, the paint, the stiff silence, he understood. "Colonel," he said, approaching with caution, "I'm Lieutenant Quinn. What happened here is unacceptable. We will investigate this thoroughly." Marcus nodded curtly. "I'd like an official record taken now. My father will provide a statement. So will I." "Of course," Quinn said, signaling the receptionist. "Please step into my office." As Marcus helped Elijah to his feet, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. Even Denton, now visibly sweating, couldn't muster a defense. He stood motionless, the paint can still on his desk like a symbol of his disgrace. Quinn paused beside him, voice low but firm. "You're done here. Don't say another word." Marcus placed a hand on his father's back as they passed, steadying him with both strength and presence. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everyone had seen enough, and for the first time that morning, someone had finally stood up. Inside Lieutenant Harold Quinn's office, the silence was not peace. It was compression, the kind that comes right before something breaks. Colonel Marcus Brooks did not sit. His posture was as sharp as his uniform, boots planted, jaw locked. He had spoken calmly when he entered, but his presence carried a charge the room couldn't absorb. Not yet. Elijah Brooks sat beside him, shoulders upright despite the dried paint matted into his silver hair. He hadn't said a word since they entered, and still his silence echoed louder than Denton's earlier insults. Across from them, Quinn opened a slim folder and clicked his pen, but his eyes didn't lower to the paper. They stayed on Marcus, reading, measuring. "Colonel," Quinn began quietly, "we'll need a full account before this goes to internal affairs." Marcus gave a single nod. "My father came here to file a report. What he received was assault and public humiliation by an officer of your department, in uniform, in front of witnesses." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Each word was a pin driven through drywall, clean, precise, irreversible. Quinn wrote without interruption. "And when I arrived," Marcus continued, "he was still sitting there, still covered in paint, still being ignored." Quinn glanced at Elijah. "Sir, do you confirm that?" "I do," Elijah replied. His voice was calm, but there was weight in every syllable. "The officer sprayed me deliberately. He told me I deserved to be marked." Quinn pressed his lips together, jotting the quote verbatim. Then came the knock. Officer Travis Denton entered. The smirk was gone. His hands fidgeted against the fabric of his uniform. He looked like a man trying not to drown in air. "You'll wait," Quinn said firmly, not looking up. "And you'll listen." Marcus turned slowly to face him. "You looked at a man 3 times your age and saw someone expendable." Denton swallowed. "I didn't know who he was. And if he'd been a homeless man with no son, if he hadn't been a decorated veteran, would you still have done it?" Denton didn't answer. "Don't worry, Knight," Marcus said. "You already did." Elijah finally looked up at the man who had humiliated him, but his eyes held no hatred. What they held was worse, disappointment. "I wore this country's uniform," Elijah said. "I bled for it. I buried friends under its flag. But I never expected to be dehumanized inside a building meant to serve justice." Denton opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Quinn closed the folder and stood. His voice, when it came, was formal. "Officer Denton, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Hand over your badge and weapon." Denton froze. "Sir, wait. My wife is 7 months pregnant. I didn't mean—" "You meant to humiliate him," You succeeded. Quinn's tone remained even. And now you face consequences. Slowly, hands trembling, Denton unclipped his badge and laid it on the desk. Then the service weapon. The silence in the room felt like a judgment. But Marcus wasn't finished. You painted my father like he was street trash, he said. But now everyone sees what really stands out. Your uniform and how little you deserved it. Denton's head dropped, then a shift outside. Through the thin wall, the soft murmur of the precinct lobby changed. Footsteps paused. A voice hushed. Someone had heard. Someone had understood. It was starting. Quinn reached for the evidence bag and sealed Denton's badge inside. This will be sent to Internal Affairs within the hour, he said, and I'll personally brief the chief. He looked up, voice quieter now. I've served in this department 30 years. I've seen racism. I've seen cowardice. But I've also seen what it costs to stay silent, and I won't do it again. There was a beat of stillness. Then Elijah stood. His legs were slow but steady. He adjusted the collar of his stained shirt with quiet precision. I didn't come here for retribution, he said. I came to be heard, to be treated like a man. He looked directly at Denton. You failed me. Then he turned to Quinn. But he didn't. Marcus stepped forward and shook Quinn's hand, firm and brief. Thank you, he said. But remember, justice delayed may be procedural. But justice denied leaves stains. As father and son stepped out of the office, the precinct had changed. Officers rose from their chairs. Some looked away, but others, especially the younger ones, stood still, watching with something close to recognition in their eyes. It wasn't fear, it was reckoning. And when Marcus opened the door for his father to step through, Elijah paused, just for a moment, and looked back. Not to gloat, to remind them, I am still here. And then they left, not triumphant, but clean. The door closed behind Elijah and Marcus Brooks with a soft, definitive click. Lieutenant Harold Quinn remained frozen for a few seconds, his hand still on the doorknob. He wasn't ready to sit down yet. The evidence bag on his desk stared back at him. Inside were a badge and a standard-issue Glock, both heavy, not in weight, but in implication. They weren't just tools, not anymore. They were symbols of power, of failure. He finally returned to his chair and sat down with a quiet grunt, then ran a hand across his face. He had thought the worst thing he'd see that week would be another budget meeting or a late-night domestic call. Not this. This wasn't procedural failure. This was moral collapse. He reached for the phone, hesitated, then pressed the direct line to Chief Davis. Davis, came the tired voice on the other end. It's Quinn, he said. We've got a serious one. He laid it all out. The incident, the victim, the officer involved, the paint, the silence in the lobby, the presence of a U.S. Army colonel with stars on his shoulders and fury in his voice. Chief Davis was quiet for a long time. You're sure? He asked finally. Absolutely. And you've already badge and weapon collected. Statements in progress. I'm preserving video now. Davis exhaled sharply. Quinn, this could go national. I know, Quinn replied, but honestly, it should. There was another pause, not of disapproval, but of reality setting in. Handle it, Davis said. All of it. Fast, clean, transparent, IADs on standby. Understood. Quinn hung up, but the line seemed to echo in his ears. He looked around the office. Same walls, same desk, same clock that ticked like nothing had changed. But something had. He felt it in his chest, in his hands, in the air itself. He had been in law enforcement 30 years, long enough to know the line between protocol and justice, and long enough to know how often they didn't overlap. With a slow breath, he stood and exited into the lobby. The shift in the room was subtle, but real. Conversations were hushed, eyes lowered and lifted again, unsure whether to meet his gaze or avoid it. The silence wasn't guilt, not yet, but it was awareness. He spotted Officer Ibarra near the front desk. Pull lobby footage from the last 2 hours, secure it. Full chain of custody. Yes, sir, she replied quickly, already reaching for the console. Behind her, a younger officer, a rookie, maybe 6 months in, stood unusually still. Quinn met his eyes for just a second. The kid didn't look away. That was new. Quinn returned to his office and sat down to write the report. At first, his hands moved out of habit, headers, timestamps, titles. But when he reached the section labeled narrative, he paused. This couldn't be just a summary. It had to be a confession. So he wrote what happened, in plain language, not sanitized. He described how Denton had degraded a man in plain sight, how no one had stopped him, how every second of silence in the room was an accomplice. But he also wrote what the badge used to mean to him, before compromise became comfort, before jokes went unchecked, before he started clocking out emotionally even as he clocked in physically. And he wrote about Elijah Brooks, not the fact that he was a veteran, not the medals, but the silence, the restraint, the pride that still clung to him even as paint clung to his skin. He finished the report slowly, carefully, and signed it with an unshaking hand. One copy for internal affairs, one he would keep, for himself, as a reminder that justice is only real if people inside the system make it real. He stood again, stretching his back, and glanced out the wire-meshed window into the lobby. The Brookses were gone, but their presence remained. In the way people now spoke a little softer, watched each other a little closer. Attention, but not fear. Something more like a conscience. He sat down once more, opened a blank email, and began typing a message to his entire precinct. Not orders, not warnings, a question. What do you want this uniform to mean tomorrow? The video was only 23 seconds long. It showed Elijah Brooks sitting alone on a hard plastic bench, dabbing at his head with a stained handkerchief. The paint had dried into stiff streaks across his temple. In the background, Officer Denton laughed faintly and walked away, twirling the empty spray can. The person who had captured it, a teenage girl waiting to file a lost ID report, uploaded it that night with a caption. He didn't even fight back. By morning, it had 500,000 views. By noon, it had headlines. Elderly veteran sprayed with paint by officer inside Atlanta. Police precinct. Vietnam vet humiliated while filing report. Son, an Army colonel, confronts abuser. Marked like trash, racism, power, and a badge. Marcus Brooks didn't speak to the press. Journalists camped outside the Pentagon gate. Others waited outside Elijah's small home. Microphones were shoved forward. Colonel, do you support the calls for national review of precinct conduct? Sir, do you believe this was racially motivated? Is your father willing to testify before Congress? He said nothing, until one reporter finally asked, "What would you say to Officer Denton right now?" Marcus looked directly into the camera. "I don't need to say anything to him. He's already heard everything he refused to see." Then he walked away. Elijah stayed inside for a while. The doorbell rang constantly. News outlets, activists, strangers. Flowers piled up. Someone left a carefully folded flag on his porch with a note that read, "You were seen. I'm sorry it took so long." One afternoon, he opened the door and found a man in a denim jacket, maybe in his 70s, holding a six-pack of root beer. No press badge, no microphone. "Bravo, company," the man said quietly. Elijah's breath caught. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. They sat on the porch, sipping warm soda, and watched as a group of neighborhood kids helped replant Elijah's garden without being asked. The precinct changed, but not all at once. Some officers remained defensive. Others were shaken. A few, like Officer Ibarra, started speaking up more often during briefings. One rookie submitted a transfer request. When asked why, he wrote, "I want to serve somewhere that's not still deciding whether this was wrong." Lieutenant Quinn read the note and didn't stop it. He knew better than to expect revolution, but he recognized the beginning of erosion. The quiet kind, the kind that works from the inside. Elijah returned to the garden on a Tuesday morning. He wore the same shirt as the day he was attacked. Not out of defiance, but because it was clean and comfortable, and he refused to let anyone redefine it. He watered his cabbage sprouts, retied the tomato vines. A neighborhood child waved at him from the sidewalk. He waved back. His dignity hadn't returned. It had never left. A month later, Marcus visited again. The news cycle had moved on, but something between them hadn't. They sat inside this time, at the small kitchen table where Elijah used to help with homework. Marcus looked down at his hands, then at his father. I should have come sooner. Elijah didn't blink. You came when it mattered. There was a long pause. I used to think silence was the best thing I could offer you, Marcus said. Let you live in peace. Keep the noise of my world out of yours. But silence, Elijah said softly, can make a man disappear. Marcus looked away. I'm not proud of what happened, Elijah continued, but I'm not ashamed either, because I stood up, and so did you. Marcus didn't respond, but he reached across the table, laid his hand over his father's. That was enough. That night, Quinn sent one final report, not to internal affairs, not to the chief, to every officer in his precinct. It wasn't long, just a few paragraphs. This uniform will not protect you from consequences. It was never meant to. It was meant to remind you of the responsibility you wear. One man bore that responsibility without a badge, without backup, and without bitterness. Try to be more like him. He signed it simply. Lieutenant H. Quinn. No one spray-painted over the truth. No one erased the footage. No one rewrote the story to make it easier to swallow. And because of that, something stayed. Not justice, not yet, but memory. And memory, when it refuses to fade, becomes something stronger than outrage. It becomes change. The mail arrived in a plain white envelope, addressed in formal type. Inside was a letter from the Georgia Veterans Association. They were holding an annual ceremony, small, regional, not televised. No cameras, just men and women who had served, gathering quietly to honor those who had held the line. They wanted to recognize Elijah Brooks, not for surviving injustice, but for surviving, full stop. Elijah stared at the invitation for a long time. Not because he didn't know what to do with it, but because part of him wondered if he wanted to be seen again, truly seen, or if silence had finally become its own comfort. He placed the envelope back on the table, next to the tiny glass box that now held the dried, empty spray can. The can had been returned to him, cleaned of fingerprints, bagged, cataloged, and logged into evidence. Internal Affairs had offered to dispose of it. Elijah declined. Now it sat beneath glass, not as a trophy, but as truth. That afternoon, Marcus arrived with groceries in silence. They didn't speak at first. Elijah made tea. Marcus unpacked bread, tomatoes, a bit of honey. They ate without fanfare. Then Marcus pulled something from his bag, a faded file folder. Inside, printouts, reports, news coverage, an article from a police ethics journal titled, When Power Paints Over People. Been collecting, he said simply. Elijah nodded. What for? Marcus hesitated. To remember, to make sure. I never get used to forgetting. Elijah sipped his tea. There's power in remembering, but more in deciding what you do with it. They sat for a moment, letting that linger. Then Marcus asked, would you have done it differently if you knew what would happen? Elijah leaned back, watching steam rise from his cup. No, he said, not the walking in, not the speaking up, not even the waiting. A beat passed. What I'd change, he continued, is maybe I would have looked him in the eye earlier, made him see me, not as a veteran, not as a symbol, but as a man. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. He understood now, finally, the difference between defending someone and standing beside them. The garden was in bloom again, tomatoes climbing strong, cabbage rows neat. One corner had been turned into a flower bed, planted by local kids who still waved as they passed. A child on a bicycle skidded to a stop and offered Elijah a red tulip from a plastic bag. He took it, said thank you, and placed it in the empty glass bottle that used to hold pepper vinegar. It sat on the windowsill. The sunlight caught both the tulip and the can beneath glass. That night, Elijah opened a chest he hadn't touched in years. Inside, medals, folded flags, a pair of combat boots still crusted with red dirt from a country that never felt like home. And the shirt, the same one he'd worn to the precinct, the one still stained with faint streaks of orange despite every attempt to clean it. He folded it carefully, not to preserve the stain, but the memory. He placed it beside the silver star, one for courage, one for consequence. A week later, Elijah stood outside the Veterans Center. He didn't speak at the ceremony. He didn't want to. He sat in the back, cap in hand, surrounded by men and women who understood things too large for words. When his name was called, he rose, accepted the certificate, nodded once, and returned to his seat. He didn't need applause. He needed acknowledgement, and for once that was enough. Back home, Marcus helped him hang the certificate. Not in the living room, not by the TV, but in the hallway by the kitchen, right above the light switch he touched every morning. "I want to see it when I wake up," Elijah said, "to remind me that sometimes standing up does matter." On the last page of Quinn's notebook, beneath the last line of his final report, a single sentence sat alone, underlined twice. "Memory holds the line when justice forgets." One morning, Elijah stood at the edge of his porch, looking out across his yard. The neighborhood was still quiet. Life had moved forward as it always does. But something stayed. Not the paint, not the shame, just the scar and the choice not to hide it. A car slowed down near the curb. A father walked his daughter past the garden. She tugged his sleeve and asked, "Dad, is that the man from the video?" The father paused, looked over at Elijah. Their eyes met. Then he knelt beside his daughter and said, "That's the man who didn't look away." Thank you for listening all the way to the end. The stories we tell aren't just about the past. They shine a light on the present and hold hope for what's ahead. What did you feel while hearing this? Tell us in the comments. Let's talk. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, click subscribe, share this video, and help amplify the voices that were once ignored. Until next time, stay honest, stay awake, and remember, some stories are meant to stay with us.